Next, we have the pleasure of hearing from Erin Higgins. She's an education research analyst at the Institute of Education Sciences.
Good morning. So I want to start with a story to help us think about how the conclusions that we draw based on data are limited by the data that we have access to and that we choose to collect. So there's a Washington Post journalist named Christopher Ingraham who is a self-proclaimed data junkie. And a bit over a year ago, he wrote about this index of the quality of a town based on its physical characteristics, things like hills, bodies of water, climate. And based on that, obviously, there was a town that was named the worst town in America. It was in the Midwest. Understandably, the people who lived in that town were somewhat distraught by this information, and so one of the local businessmen reached out to him and said, please come visit our town and see all the great things we have to offer. After visiting, he actually moved his family there. So twin kids, everybody goes there, spends a year there, and then he recently wrote this new article where he talks about what it's like to live in what was deemed the worst town in America. And what he talks about is that there were all these factors that were just not included in that index that made this town great. So for example, he talks about the sound of the breeze rustling the grain, or the dry, sweet smell of a field full of sunflowers, both of which aren't captured in this index. So in this index, there are these easily observable, easy to measure factors that are included, but then all of these more difficult to measure or perhaps unique to this town kinds of measures that are just completely forgotten. So what if we had a way to collect data on those? Obviously, the conclusions we draw based on these data would look very different. And so like this index of a town's quality, in education, we've also kind of missed the mark in terms of measuring the critical factors that lead to successful learning and high-quality teaching. So our index, as we've heard over and over again throughout this conference, has traditionally been summative assessments of student performance. And when we rely solely on those data, we're failing to capture the entire picture of this learning and assessment process. So for instance, we miss out on measuring the struggle that a student has as he or she tries to overcome a misconception when learning science concepts, or the anxiety that a student feels when they're trying to solve a math problem, or the kinds of gesturing and language that a teacher uses to draw attention to a particular thing on the board as they're teaching. These are all really useful sources of information, and information that up until now we really haven't been able to measure accurately. And so by not measuring these things, our approach has limited our ability to truly understand what that learning and assessment process looks like. So we're now at this forefront of this potentially transformative time where we have innovations in education technology and other technologies like remote eye trackers or portable EEG systems that provide us with this window into the learning process, and it's really exciting. But what I want to say more about today is that the way in which we're using these data is what's really going to get us further and improve education practice in the ways that we want. And by that I mean we need to think about issues like what are we measuring and what are we still not measuring? What questions are these data trying to address? And do we have the right research designs to address them? And finally, how do these data fit in with what we already know about the science of learning? As we've heard about from a number of speakers, we have a wealth of information from that field that we can bring in to help us think more about how to design effective personalized interventions for students. So first, we need to consider what it is that we're measuring. Even when it seems like we're capturing all of this information in a log file, there are things that we're not capturing, as we've, again, heard about throughout this conference. So the most comprehensive log file data is not necessarily going to tell you anything about the context in which this learning is occurring. Are students interacting with teachers or students as they use this educational game? And so as we draw conclusions based on the data that we're collecting, we need to be mindful of the fact that we're still not getting everything. And so when we engage in the kind of learning analytics and educational data mining approaches that have become so popular, we need to still think about a hypothesis testing kind of approach. And we need to think about a theory of change for the interventions that we're developing to ensure that we're being strategic in measuring the things that we think are important. And relatedly, we need to make sure that we're collecting high quality data. So the measures need to be valid and reliable measures of student behavior and thinking. And you know, we hear it all the time that garbage in, garbage out, you know, is kind of the mantra of this educational data mining approach. Again, I think there's a lot of value to it, but we need to still be mindful of issues of reliability and validity as we collect those kinds of data. And then second, we need to think about what questions our data collection efforts are trying to answer. And by that I mean lots of data doesn't mean anything if you don't have high quality designs that match the research questions that you're interested in answering. So in the context of this big data and education conversation, I've heard many people talk about the value of predictive models. And remember, though, that predictive modeling alone doesn't say anything about the interventions that work best and for whom. So for instance, if we learn that a student who asks for more hints in the context of an intelligent tutoring system gets better performance on a test later on, that doesn't say anything about how we intervene, right? Because it could be that the students who ask for more hints know more about themselves, they know what they know and they don't know better than those other students. It could be that the hints themselves are helpful. The information just provided to us by the data doesn't get us to that kind of level of understanding. So we need to use the kinds of strong research designs that we've been employing with more traditional data collection efforts to ask questions about effectiveness and to better understand why something is happening. If our goal is to personalize learning through education technology, we need to use this combination of predictive models with small-scale experimentation and randomized control trials to get there. And third, we need to take advantage of the wealth of information we already have from the science of learning. There are already resources out there to help with this effort. We've heard of some of those already. I'll highlight a couple here. So for example, the National Academies is currently updating their popular volume, How People Learn, and that will be out shortly. The Institute of Education Sciences published a while back, but I think it's still very relevant, the Guide Organizing Instruction and Study to Improve Student Learning. And finally, there are learning scientists who have started to weigh in on these issues and have published papers that try to synthesize the body of knowledge we already have in ways that can inform education practice. Here are a couple of examples. So again, we can use what we know from the science of learning as a starting point to help us think about ideas for how to effectively intervene and improve student outcomes. So like the Washington Post journalist who moved to this town, he had named worst town in America, and suddenly noticed all these other factors that made that town great. We now have access to rich data sets that provide us with the kind of information we need to make informed decisions about education and can tell us more about why one student might be struggling while another is doing well. But in order to realize the true potential of the variety and volume of data we now have access to, we need to keep in mind what we're measuring and not measuring, research design, and the body of knowledge we already have about how people learn. And if we do all of those things, then I think that data really does have the potential to get us to this goal of developing effective, personalized interventions for students. So thank you, and here's my contact information.